I'm Julian Franklin, and this is the 8th in a series of discussions with C. Northcote Parkinson, the well-known British author, historian, and political scientist, on his theories of the evolution of political forms. Dr. Parkinson, we've just finished a complete trip around your set of political cycles from monarchy through oligarchy and on to democracy and dictatorship. Now, I recall in our discussion of dictatorship last time, you made the very challenging assertion that probably the Soviet regime is not to be classified as a dictatorship at all, and that you'd prefer to think of it as a theocracy. Perhaps this time you'd like to tell us what you mean by theocracy and how it fits into your classification of political forms.
Well, theocracy is one form of rule by a few. It is a form of oligarchy, but a special form because in a theocracy the theory is that the rule is actually by God. There are peoples who have discarded the idea of a living, visible ruler and preferred the idea of an invisible ruler who is God. This has occurred in various parts of the world. Tibet, of course, to this day, is a form of theocracy, Buddhist theocracy. But the example familiar to most people in the Western world is that of the Old Testament. And we find that in this history of the Jewish peoples, they had kings at certain stages, but in time the idea grew up that they must have no actual king because Jehovah was their king. And after that, to propose a king was rather against their general tendency, against their general theory. And so they had, instead of a king, a priesthood, and from time to time these people called prophets, who may have been outside the ranks of the priesthood, but assumed a particular function in interpreting what Jehovah wanted the people to do.
Then you think that theocracy is ruled by priests?
Well, of course, they would claim that it is ruled by God. From the point of view of one who does not necessarily share their religion, it appears to be simply ruled by priests.
Are there any cases of monarchical theocracy?
There probably are. At any rate, a theocracy which includes a king within the priesthood as the sort of head of it. But in Egypt, there was a priesthood as well as a king, and the king was, so to speak, the center of the priesthood. And I think the same was probably true among the Aztecs and Incas. I think it's quite common for monarchy to come into it as long as the king is theoretically inferior to the invisible God.
I remember, Professor Parkinson, that in our discussion of monarchy, you tended to link kingship very closely with divinity. The idea that the king is somehow very intimately associated with God, or in some cases is even a god himself. But in this sense, this linkage of monarchy and theocracy, how do you distinguish theocracy from other political forms? Doesn't this suggest that theocracy is not so much a special form of government, but only a form of legitimation of governments?
Well, I use it more in the sense where the power rests in a priesthood rather than in a king. That doesn't exclude the being a king, but in the classic examples of theocracy, there is, I think, no king, but there is very definitely a priesthood. And the priests, in fact, have the main influence in the running of the state.
Are there any differences in the kind of theocracy you get depending on the kind of religion or the notion of God that a people have?
Well, one very obvious difference is whether the people is content to have its own religion and keep that religion for home consumption, or whether they regard their religion as something for export. And there are the missionary religions, as one may call it, or the militant religions of the world, of which Buddhism was perhaps the first, in which the believers desire to convert other people This is by no means invariable with religions, and a lot of people who are quite content to allow other people to believe in what they choose. But there are these other religions, beginning with Buddhism, going on to Christianity and Islam, and then, of course, the various branches of Christianity, which are penetrated by this desire to convert and to influence other people and spread their belief over the world.
Well, which religion would you say is the most theocratic in this sense, or the most missionary in its zeal?
I think Christianity has the reputation and the history which would give it that preeminence.
Certainly been the most successful.
I think you could call it the most successful too.
Well, there is a certain tendency, of course, in Christianity to divorce the church and the state. Are there any religions which perhaps emphasize the use of political power for conversion more than Christianity?
Well, I suppose Islam does that. There the church and state are in a way more closely identified than in Christianity.
What is the Islamic doctrine on this?
Well, first of all, in Islam, there is no priesthood in the sense in which other religions have a priesthood, so that the powers of priest come to be exercised in a great measure by the ruler, whoever he may be. And there are teachers of Muslim theology, and there are jurisprudence experts who explain Islamic law, but there is no priesthood as apart from the rulers, and the rulers under Islamic law are allowed a particular authority as the leaders of Islam, as well as rulers of the state.
Well, how does the Quran view the missionary function of the Islamic king or ruler? What is he supposed to do?
The Quran allows this thing called the Holy War, which is this process by which the power of Islam is to be extended over the world. And in the early days, of course, it was extended very considerably both to the east and to the west. The original impetus of Islam carried it in one direction as far as Spain and into France, and in the other direction as far as China, so that it was impelled in its early days by what one can regard as a terrific impetus. This was one of conversion to some extent, but only up to a certain point, because the early Muslims seem often to have been content to conquer territory and make the peoples of the territory subordinate to the followers of Islam, but they were not always as intent on converting them. Partly, I think, for the reason that in most Islamic territories, the non-believers were subject to special taxation, and the idea of converting too many people didn't always attract rulers who felt that their fiscal basis of administration might be somewhat weakened if they allowed wholesale conversions to the faith.
Do you regard Judaism as a potentially theocratic religion with a mission to convert or to dominate other religions?
Well, Judaism has the distinction of being very much at the origin of both Christianity and Islam. It's the older version from which the others derive. And it brought with it an intolerance towards other religions. That's very obvious in the Old Testament, that the gods of rival tribes are regarded as demons or devils or generally undesirable characters. The Jews had a jealous God, and he would have no other gods but himself, and this was very much laid down as is part of the basis of their faith. This did not seem to imply a great desire to convert other people. They had no great reputation for that, although it sometimes happened. They didn't seem to disapprove of it, but they didn't go out of their way to make converts. On the other hand, they certainly lacked this easygoing attitude of, say, the Greeks, who were quite content to accept the gods of other people and say, oh, well, they are the equivalent of our gods. The name you are using for your god is your local name for the Zeus, and so on, so that it made them very easygoing over it. And the Jews were certainly quite the opposite of that.
Could you give us a case in which theocracy became established in the Orient?
Well, there are one or two interesting examples. Japan at one time very nearly became a Buddhist state and showed for a very short period the sort of way it might have developed. That was checked by the Japanese aristocracy, who were not having Buddhism beyond a certain point as a political power. And the next example which succeeded is certainly that of Tibet, where we have a state until very recent times in which the political power was vested in a priesthood centering on the Dalai Lama, the chief priest of the organization, and where a great deal of the activities of the country seems to have been bound up with very large Buddhist monasteries in which there are considerable numbers of monks devoted to worship and living in a highly organized and almost entirely religious society.
Well, in a theocracy like Tibet, where God is supposed to rule directly or through a spokesman, it must be a rather difficult problem, at least in theory, to determine who that spokesman is. How do the Tibetans make sure that the man who speaks the word of God isn't an impostor?
Well, the word of God for the Buddhist is in the Buddhist scripture, first of all, so that anything contrary to scripture could probably be ruled out. I think that limits very much what a possible impostor could do, because that is a religion of a book, just as Islam is a religion of a book, and just as Christianity, at least for a great number of people, is the religion of a book. Of course, under Catholic rule, a considerable latitude is given to the leader, the Pope, the living representative of God. But in these other religions, God's word has been given once and for all and taken down in writing, and that remains the test of orthodoxy by which future teachers are judged, and if they run against it, they can be ruled out as heretical.
Isn't one of the weaknesses of theocracy, perhaps, the fact that priesthoods usually aren't hereditary?
Sometimes they are. I don't know whether that would be a weakness. I think the greater weakness is in the static nature of the book. I don't know whether to have a book is essential to a revealed religion, but in fact the most important revealed religions of the world do center on a holy scripture, and the danger of that from the political point of view is that the scripture, however originally composed and however divinely inspired, if you like, was designed for a different society than that into which the people concerned have moved, so that the rules, shall we say, applicable to a nomadic tribe of Semitic peoples in the desert have then to be applied successively to the same people under an agricultural state, and then to their descendants later on in an urbanized civilization. And one is bound to feel that the circumstances in the end are not envisaged by the original lawgiver.
Unless you have a good lawyer to do some interpreting.
Well, you can do some interpreting on that, but in practice the book seems to have been, in most cases, adhered to fairly closely.
Would you think that perhaps the Supreme Court in the United States is a sort of priesthood? We have our holy text, you know.
I know, but there is a better example of the present time than the United States, and that, I think, is Soviet Russia.
Why, specifically?
Don't you think that it's fair to regard communism as a religion of the modern world? Of course, people talking about a religion rather expect there to be a God in the first instance. But I don't know that that's necessary even of the other religions. Buddha, for example, the founder, Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, probably believed in no God in the sense that his followers have come to believe in him. And so if one allows that a religion is not necessarily marked in the first instance by belief in a God, as I'd certainly think was the case, we then find that communism shares with the other revealed religions rather a remarkable series of advantages in its propagation. One has, first of all, the Holy Book.
Which one is this?
Das Kapital by
see.
Karl Marx. One has the more or less divine founder, under Marx, of the organization, in Lenin, preserved in his glass case in the Red Square of Moscow, and visited by thousands of people as pilgrims to a shrine. You then have the priesthood of experts in Marxism who will argue about and explain the sacred text. You have a very definite missionary impulse to spread that faith in different parts of the world, and incidentally missionaries who seem quite willing to give their lives, as other missionaries have done, in order to spread the faith. You have the reverent attitude of thousands towards a religion which they perhaps imperfectly understand. You have the portrait of Lenin or the bust of Stalin, perhaps Stalin less so at the moment, but whoever is the leader of the moment ends off with his bust or portrait exhibited in all public places. You have a sort of act of worship in the schools, which people stand up before beginning the morning's work, chanting some hymn in praise of the party and of their faith by which they're supposed to be indoctrinated. I think the comparisons are too numerous to rule out communism from the ranks of the revealed religions of the world.
Buddhism doesn't have a god in the Western sense, but it's supernaturalist. You don't think communism is supernaturalist, do you?
Well, Buddhism, to be precise, I think, exists on two very different levels. If you find the most intellectual Buddhist, of the sort of man who might be abbot of a Buddhist monastery, may be extremely highly educated, his religion is by way of a philosophy following very much on the lines of Gautama himself. But for the mass of Buddhists, I think it would be quite true to say that they have made a god of Gautama himself, that he is their god to all intents and purposes.
Which is very similar to the veneration, say, of Lenin.
Exactly. The atheist ends off as a god.
But doesn't even the learned Buddhist believe in incarnations and metempsychosis and various other supernatural phenomena?
Yes, he does, but he's not as influenced by the processions and the banners and the flags and all the apparatus of the religion.
I know some people, when they talk of a communist theocracy, will compare it to Islam, and others to Russian Orthodoxy. What religion do you think communism, in the sense that you regard it as a theocracy, most resembles?
I think that it derives from Islam in one sense. I think that it has other sources as well, Russian Orthodoxy certainly being one. I think that the way I regard it is this, that in the world there's been a sort of pendulum movement between East and West. If one goes back far enough, I think one might find its earliest recorded origin perhaps in the Siege of Troy, where you find in Homer's record of it a conflict going on between certain groups of, we may roughly say, Eastern and Western princes round about the Dardanelles. And presumably the struggle was in fact for control of the Dardanelles and for the trade route which ran through it. In subsequent ages, you find that the same conflict has continued with a rather accelerated pendulum movement, the different phases of aggression. And I'm using aggression now not in a narrowly military sense, but aggression in the sense of economic pressure, intellectual ascendancy, education, religion, all sorts of other aspects. That these phases of aggression have swung backwards and forwards. Now there's been a phase, say, during Alexander's time, when the West has been influencing the East, penetrating it, right up to the point, incidentally, where, to this day, in Malaya, the part of the East where I know well, children are christened Iskander, which is simply Alexander, called after Alexander the Great, the children not usually knowing that that is in fact the origin of their names, but that's quite common, Iskander as a name, right down through Southeast Asia, which shows, incidentally, how far ahead of him Alexander's reputation had gone. Then, in Roman times, the pressure was maintained to some extent, then died away, and the Romans decided not to push any further eastwards. And then you come to this later period of Islam, when the pressure is the other way. And not only merely in the form of Islamic aggression into Europe, along the north coast of Africa, into Sicily, into Spain, across the Pyrenees, and into France, but also in the way that Europe itself, were untouched by Islam, was nevertheless being very much influenced by Oriental ideas. Christianity, to start with, is an Oriental religion, which had come from the East into Europe, and, of course, was predominant in that period. Gothic architecture is something which comes from the East into Europe, and a whole set of different customs prevalent in the Middle Ages found their origin in the East, and moreover, during that period, there's no doubt that most enlightened thinkers in the West were fully conscious of that technological inferiority to, shall we say, Byzantium, the Eastern Empire, and with a very good idea of the wonders of the East. Of course, Marco Polo came back with his stories of that later on. And of course, they were quite right. People who voyaged from Europe into the Far East in the Middle Ages were going from a less civilized to a more civilized area, and could come back with stories of quite remarkable technical achievements which they had witnessed, and which they were happy to describe when they were once more round their own firesides. Now, there you have a brief picture of that Oriental phase of Western history, and then, at the end of the Middle Ages, the swing goes the other way. And for the next few hundred years, it's the West which has its great influence on the East, and the successive missionaries, travelers, traders, soldiers, sailors, teachers were flowing into the East, and their ideas flowing ahead of them. That phase goes right on until the beginning of the present century. My own guess is that Western pressure on the Far East died out, to all intents and purposes, round about 1910, just after the turn of the century. And now the tide is beginning to move in the other direction.
Do I take it that you're suggesting that communist theocracy is an Oriental reaction against the Western influence?
To a large extent it was. More than that, I'd say that whereas the last wave of aggression, in the special sense of the word, from the East was spearheaded by Islam, the coming movement which is beginning is spearheaded and represented by communism. Behind it is a much bigger movement than communism, but communism is the form in which the renaissance of the East is being embodied in our time.
Yet, curiously enough, the Bible, as you call it, of the Soviet state is Western.
I don't agree.
You don't think that Marx is Western?
No. Marx was Jewish, and in his character I see all the characteristics of a Jewish prophet. And his book has been very significantly called the Bible of the Working Man, people have seen in it an equivalent of the Bible. In form, it's supposed to be a book about economics. But that isn't in fact the way it's regarded. It's become a holy book in very much this Oriental tradition.
Is this due to something in Marx or simply what people made of him?
Partly because the book's so unreadable. I think his own fanatical attitude, which appears intermittently in the book, his hatred boils over from time to time, very much as the hatred of the Jewish prophets boils over time and again in the Old Testament.
Do you think anybody who strongly and passionately believes in political doctrine is theocratic or religious?
I think he has a tendency that way, because once you are beginning to believe passionately in something, you have rather ceased to test politics by the more practical tests. You end off by wanting communism for its own sake, rather than because you can believe and show that it is a more efficient way of organizing society.
Perhaps in that sense you would have to call the Declaration of the Rights of Man at the time of the French Revolution a holy text.
I think it had much of the character of it. It was something in which people fervently believed, rather than wish to discuss in great detail at the moment.
In fact, most political ideologies tend to take on a religious form, don't they?
Yes, or the briefer form of a slogan.
Are there any other aspects in Marx, aside from his passionate belief, which give it the character of a religious prophecy as opposed to an economic theory?
Yes, because, of course, there is this element of prophecy in it. He's not all that specific as a prophet, but he does point to the future. He says that a certain sequence of events is bound to happen, as the prophet has foretold, and that as the economic progress of an urbanized society goes on, the poor will become poorer and the rich will become richer, and then the moment will come when the poor will rise and dispossess the rich, and then will begin the dictatorship of the proletariat, and after that the state as such will wither away.
Sounds a bit apocalyptic.
It is rather apocalyptic.
There are many interesting analogies which you've developed between politics following religion here. What do you think of the comparison that's sometimes made between the Communist Party in Russia as an elite and the Jesuit order in the Catholic Church?
I think that is a very valid comparison. I
So-
notice, by the way, that you've been using the term analogy as between communism and the other religions. I don't use the word analogy. I think it is a religion. And I think that the readiness of the communist to give his life, both in the sense of spending it and give his life in the sense of sacrificing for this particular set of doctrines, is something which is characteristic of a religion and not characteristic of a political belief. Most socialists, for example, think that society would be better if it were organized in the way that they would have it organized. But they're not mostly willing to go to the stake for their belief. They're not going to be martyred for it. They're not going to sacrifice their lives on the barricades, because after all, they're concerned with the political convenience and efficiency of society. But the attitude of the communist has this note of intolerance, this readiness to sacrifice the individual, which is only religious. And of course the elite, in being elaborately trained for this kind of missionary work and this kind of sacrifice, if need be, are very like the Jesuits.
Plus their authoritarian structure, perhaps.
Exactly. One other point which I've noticed, and I say this in no disrespect for Catholicism, but in fact I've come across a number of instances where the strongest Catholics have been converted to communism, and without notable alteration in their character, as apart from their beliefs, have become as fervent in their defense of communism as they previously were of Catholicism. And I find, incidentally, that where this has happened, the Catholics, as a rule, do not readily give up hope of winning them back, and no doubt vice versa.
Many communists, for example, who, when they defect from the party, become Catholics.
Yes, well, you have this same readiness to accept authority. There's a similarity in character in which, of course, I'm not trying to draw any similarity in doctrine.
Well, just to embarrass you a bit, suppose I ask you whether you might not state the entire proposition in the reverse. Could you say it's not so much that the Communist Party is a religious order as that the Jesuit movement is a totalitarian organization?
I don't think that's as helpful in understanding it. I think that the Jesuit organization falls short of the totalitarian in a number of ways, and I think that totalitarianism is something which the communists share with other organizations, other parties of a rather different character.
Such as the Nazi Party, for example?
Yes, I don't think one could have called that religious. It had its sort of hysterical side. It had a kind of cult of the pagan gods. That was only shared in by relatively few, so far as I can make out. They were the sort of crazy left wing of the party.
Well, what about the leader principle in National Socialism? The Führerprinzip, the idea of Hitler as a kind of super embodiment of the spirit of the race. Would you regard that as a religious conception?
It had religious elements, I've no doubt of that, but it lacked the permanence and the serious character of communism. It hasn't the same intellectual appeal.
No developed theology in that sense.
No, I think it was rather an illiterate man's belief, a rather primitive religion as compared with communism.
Why does theocracy develop in the Soviet Union in this late and allegedly advanced age? What are the causes?
Well, one is that they'd had it all along. They were a very backward people before the revolution as compared with the rest of the world, and their characteristic institution then was a Tsar, which is the same word as Caesar in its shortened Russian form, harking back to the Roman Empire again, but a Caesar who in their case had absorbed the powers of the church very largely in himself. In the Eastern version of Christianity, as opposed to the Western, the emperor of Byzantium had a far stronger position. He was the head of the church, in a sense that the Western emperor never could be. After all, the Western emperor always had the Pope to contend against. But the Eastern emperor never had. He was the Pope.
Isn't the term sometimes used for this Caesaropapism?
Exactly. And the Tsar inherited that in Russia. He regarded himself as, in fact, the successor of the Byzantine emperors. And his people regarded him as that. It's the Orthodox religion, which I think is rather a significant word, perhaps, in this context, that orthodoxy was one characteristic of the Russia of those days.
And the communists certainly insist on orthodoxy.
I think they took over a great deal of the mechanism of what they already found. After all, what else could they do?
I was just going to ask a more general question about that. The leaders of the communist revolution, Lenin, Trotsky, and others, were, for the most part, rather Western-trained, Western-oriented, and were trying to break with the Tsarist tradition and the Orthodox tradition. They thought themselves as revolutionaries. How do you explain that they should have reintroduced it in a different form?
Well, I think it's probably true to say that some of the early leaders were in the Western tradition. Of course, a lot of them had spent a good bit of their lives in Western Europe, in exile, in fact, before the revolution took place, so that the connection with the West was certainly there. But I think that I perceive that Russia since then has rather retreated towards the East. I suppose symbolic of that was that whereas the Tsars had their capital at one time in what they called St. Petersburg or Petrograd, which is the Russians' window on the West, the tendency of the Soviet regime was to move their capital further east to Moscow, and of course since then, partly under the pressure of war, they've tended to move some of their industries further east still.
With all of the texts to choose from, how come they chose Marx?
I think that that has very much to do with the actual personality of Lenin. Lenin was the strong man among the original, quite small Russian group which eventually returned, in effect, to conquer Russia in 1917. Well, it was quite a small group. Lenin was its very intolerant leader who excluded from the group all who disagreed with him, and to Lenin, Marx's works appealed very much through a similarity in character between Marx and Lenin. And it was he who, above all, made that one prophet the inspired leader of the movement which Lenin himself brought to victory.
Then were it not for this similarity of character between Lenin and Marx, it might have taken on a very different form.
I think quite possibly because contemporaries of Lenin were more liberal in their attitude than he was, some fully as remarkable as men perhaps, but what they lacked was his singleness of purpose, his intolerance, and his complete concentration on his single task of bringing communism to power.
I think in your evolution of political thought, you were struck by certain similarities between the cult of Stalin, which is now known as the cult of personality, and some of the cults that were given to the Egyptian king.
Oh, yes. Of course, I was rather confusing the issue by harking back to the leader's actual authority, which, of course, is something quite distinct from the prestige which he may be given. My own belief is that the group, the Theocracy, as I've called it, this innermost caucus of the Communist Party, built up the character of one of themselves by methods of deliberate publicity and exploiting the religious veneration which the simpler people of Russia had previously rendered to their emperor and were really wanting to render to someone else, so that they could refer in their press to their divine leader in very much the same sort of terms as one finds in the most ancient times used of the most oriental despots. Of course, it doesn't make the leader more despotic because he's being addressed in those terms, but nevertheless it shows the attitude of mind of the worshippers. And there's a lot of evidence of that. I remember reading once, and I think quoting somewhere, the case of Stalin's name being mentioned, I think, 95 times in a single issue of the official Russian newspaper Pravda, and each time with a different epithet, as the unequaled leader, the inspirer of science, the greatest man of our time, the military genius of the age, and so on, all very much in the oriental pattern of flattery which one might have found in Byzantium or in old Delhi in India.
These religious elements are certainly striking. Is it possible to say, however, that perhaps all of the things that happened in the Soviet Union are simply the outcome of attempting to impose socialism on a backward country?
I think that they are largely the result of that, but the situation, nevertheless, which results from that, is what we have to deal with. That is what we have to confront. We can explain it in various ways, but of course, by this present age, we have to consider communism not merely in its Russian form, but behind that in its Chinese form.
Well, it has a similar function there, doesn't it? Industrialization.
It has a similar function. The pattern is rather the same, but the Chinese communism now has a history going back to 1928, and it has this particular function in the world, or the danger, as some people would see it, that the Chinese had become so dispersed through the world before their country became communist, and these outlying groups of Chinese all over the world seem to be placed as possible emissaries and missionaries of communism in a way that the Russians were not.
Isn't it possible, though, despite certain similarities to religious elements, the social function of the communist regimes is radically different from other theocracies?
That may be so. It certainly goes far more in the economic sphere than past theocracies have gone. It has this aspect of industrialization which is carried with it, because it's generally accepted that communism is the belief of an urban rather than an agricultural society.
But communism has been very successful in the Far East, which is almost overwhelmingly agricultural. How do you explain that?
I think I might mention, first of all, the origin of communism in Singapore. It started there in about 1928, very soon after communism was established in southern China, and first organized by Chinese who had been fully trained in Russia and who formed a hard core of indoctrinated believers. Some of these came to Singapore in approximately 1928 to set up an organization there, which they did in an office building in the center of the town. What was very startling about this as a story is that the British police of the time saw this happening, obtained the services of an extremely astute Chinese agent from Hong Kong, and managed to infiltrate him into the Communist Party in Singapore. He was so able that he rose in rank until he became Secretary General of it, so that for a number of years the Secretary General in fact was a police officer, which reminds me, by the way, of that fascinating book by G.K. Chesterton, in which he shows an anarchist group in which the same thing has happened, and at the crisis of the story the police officer rises to his feet and proposes to arrest the remainder of the council, and one after another they each get up and show their badges until it turns out that they're all police officers. Well, that didn't happen in Singapore, but they did have this astonishing piece of detective work at the start, which, until the Japanese came, was responsible for keeping the thing under very good control, really. At least the police always knew exactly what was happening and periodically intervened and arrested the principal people concerned, without, incidentally, the Secretary General's part in this being detected at all. And he remained in office during the Japanese period and continued the same relationship with the Japanese as he previously had with the British. However, that's a story which I mustn't go into in detail, fascinating, by the way, as I think it is.
Yes, certainly is.
But after the war, the communists had been very largely disrupted and, in fact, massacred by the Japanese, who didn't hold with communism, and rebuilt their organization quite rapidly and efficiently in that part of the world until in 1948 they had secured control of a number of the trades unions. The governor, or rather I should say the Commissioner General of Malaya at the time, then proceeded to take fairly drastic action against unions of this kind, and it was at that point in 1948 that the fully indoctrinated communists took to the jungle and started an actual civil war for turning Malaya into a communist state under their control. They were able to do this partly because the situation after the Japanese left was very disorganized, partly because in that situation weapons were fairly easy to obtain, and partly because they could count on a fair measure of sympathy in the Chinese population of the country, which might not in many cases be actively fighting with them, but were nevertheless sufficiently in sympathy to provide food for the people in the jungle.
This tactic of guerrilla revolution, territorially based, is somewhat different, isn't it, from the classical model of communist revolution established in the Soviet Union?
I think it is different, and it was not successful. The war has dragged on now for 10 years, and the communist terrorists, as they're called, in the jungle, have on the whole dwindled during that time. They've had a tremendous nuisance value. They've pinned down thousands of troops. I've been present myself in operations where as much as a brigade of infantry has been put into the jungle in pursuit of a maximum number of 14 terrorists who may or may not have been there, and in this instance turned out not to be there. But that's the sort of scale of the thing.
This is, by the way, I think Mao's invention. Mao Zedong of China. He developed a technique. It worked very well in China, didn't it?
It may have been the comparison with China which inspired it.
Inspired it in Malaya, yes.
But there's very little evidence of any direct connection between China and Malaya. There's been no trace of weapons.
I meant as a model of a tactic.
As a model of tactics, I think probably China did, in fact, provide the needed example. Anyway, it's dragged on for all these years, and as it's gradually coming to its end, or seems to be doing so, the emphasis is beginning to shift over to something which, in the long run, is probably more dangerous, and that is the underground penetration of political parties and trades unions by people who don't call themselves communists. Of course, they can't do that, because that would lead to their arrest if they did, and in fact would lead to their execution in some cases. But their penetration goes on under various disguises as left-wing socialists, and in the long run, the more dangerous tendency. And against that, another war is being waged by the special branch of the police, who work day and night in trying to trace and track down all these activities in which school children are indoctrinated at so-called picnics, and all these other activities go on.
We've gotten a little bit away from our theme of theocracy, of course, but that's all to the good, I think, in view of all the interesting things you've told us about the Far East. But I'd like to ask another question on theocracy here, and about communism more particularly. You've been pointing out the theoretical and oriental element that lies behind communism, and yet you also indicate and agree that this elite, this ruling priesthood, as you'd like to think of it, introduces industrialization and modern technology for all sorts of reasons of its own. Isn't it possible, as this theocracy begins to introduce more and more of a Western style of economic system that'll destroy its own basis of acceptance?
Here we're coming very much into the realms of speculation. We can't point to examples of this already having happened, but there are tendencies that way, simply to this extent, that what is sometimes called the managerial revolution in the Western world, and that's the movement by which technical experts seem to be becoming more important either than financiers or workmen or minor technicians, so that the organization man, in the phrase that is sometimes used, is becoming so important in Western society. Well, in the same way, it may well be that the organization man may, in time, or may have already begun to bring about a silent revolution in communist countries, so that the managerial revolution may have its counterpart there.
Do you think perhaps that the promised liberalization, the Soviet regime which has occurred under Malenkov and Khrushchev, represent the beginnings of this influence of the new, or I guess it's sometimes called the new Russian middle classes?
Well, it might do, but I should be more convinced of that if I could observe there any strong tendency for the technician or the highly qualified expert to take high political office among the more intolerant, indoctrinated communists. We know that the Russians employ people like scientists and engineers and experts in all fields. If we saw these actually coming into the highest offices, I think we could anticipate that some such process was well underway. But I think that is a movement of the future rather than of the present.
Well, since we've been getting into speculation, let me pull out all the stops. You've said that all regimes are ultimately destined to turn into something else. What about the communist theocracy? How are its days numbered, or aren't they?
Well, I think that it might well turn into a form of democracy in time by the same sort of process of a larger and larger number of people being admitted into the ruling class. The Russians themselves have been very much on guard against this process and have limited membership of the Communist Party in a very deliberate way. It's a very small minority of the Russian population, even to this day, as I understand, and they've shown every inclination to keep it so. But if at the future time the Communist Party were to grow, more and more people being admitted, I think its character would change at the same time. And of course, as against that, the kind of technical changes which may bring unforeseen developments in the West may also bring unforeseen developments in the East.
Well, I suppose you'd agree, Dr. Parkinson, that among the problems of vastly expanding technology is the increasing horror of a possible war. And, you know, it occurs to me that you yourself are a military historian, and it's one of your special enthusiasms. And in the course of our previous discussions, you frequently commented on the influence of war on political forms. I remember especially that was the case when we discussed oligarchy. In our next discussion, Professor Parkinson, I'd like to go into this phenomenon of war a bit further with you. I'd like to find out your opinions on the relationship of war to the development of power and political forms.